Welcome to another Excel VBA tutorial. In today's video, we are going to cover arrays in VBA. So, what are arrays? Arrays are basically collections of similar pieces of information or data that we can store with kind of in the same variable. And so they give us a certain level of flexibility because what we can do is we can take information in our worksheet, for example, and we can store all those pieces of information in the same variable, and then at which point we can loop through that variable to get each individual piece of information out of it, or something along that nature. Really, in a certain sense, we just need to think of them as lists. So they're like a list of information. Each list is made up of individual elements or positions, and each of those positions can contain different values of information. So they do come in handy because it does allow us to either take information maybe from our worksheet and then display it somewhere, but in a nice, easy fashion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump in my VBA editor, and we'll just walk through some really basic examples of, how do we work with arrays, how do we declare them, and how do we need to think about them. So I'm going to jump in my VBA editor, and then as you can tell, I already have a subroutine all planned out, so we're just going to kind of walk through it. I'm going to double check and make sure everything's commented out before I start going through it. So the first thing that we naturally have to do is, how do we work with arrays? How do we declare this kind of special type of variable like a list? Well, there's actually a couple different ways we can do it, and the most basic way that you'll start out with is you use the dim keyword. You pass through the name of your array with brackets, so these two little things right here, and then you specify the starting position of your array and the ending position, also the element. So in this example, what I am doing is I'm declaring a new array, and it will have the range of from 0 to 3. Or in other words, it will have 4 positions: position 0, position 1, position 2, and position 3. Once I've declared my array, I use the as keyword, and then I specify the data type. Depending on what type of information you're storing in your array, this is kind of the tricky part. If it's storing all of the same pieces of information, you can specify the actual data type itself. So for example, if I'm expecting it for this array to contain only strings, then I can say I want to declare my array as a string data type. However, for example, if we try to store multiple different types of numbers, we got to be careful, because if we know the size of our number before we run the program, and we can always guarantee that that size of number will particularly work with that group, then we can declare the data type with that particular number. However, if we have a longer number than what we specify in our data type, or for example, we now try to specify a string and a number, then what we have to do is we have to declare it as a variant, because we know variant is really kind of this broad, covering variable data type that basically encompasses all the different data types in VBA. And so by declaring it as variant, we can store strings, we can store numbers, we can store decimals, all sorts of pieces of information in our array, and we're not limited to what we can store in it by what we define in the beginning of our code. So that's the only thing you have to keep in mind. If it's all the same piece of information and you can make sure it's going to be all the same pieces of information, then simply declare it as that particular data type. If you cannot guarantee or you're not sure, declare it as variant. Now we can kind of simplify this little line right here if we so choose. We don't have to specify 0 and 2. We can just simply pass through 3. So this is literally the same way of writing the above statement, but we've now negated the starting position. So this one will still have 4 positions: 0, 1, 2, and 3. Now there is no reason why we have to start at position 0. We can start at maybe position 1, and then in this example it's going from 1 to 3. Here's what I'm going to tell you. Yes, you can do it. I don't encourage you to do it, because almost any other program language you encounter, everything is 0-based. So just get in the habit now, start working 0-based. It will make your life easier when you transition over to other program languages. Now, just because we can start at 1 doesn't mean we necessarily have to. We can start at 2, 3, 4, whatever we so choose. I don't really know an example of why you would want to do this. It would be a very, very unique example as to why you would want to do this. And more than likely, you probably could avoid it altogether. But again, for demonstration purposes, yes, you can do that. Now, in all these examples, I kind of made an assumption at the beginning of it. I assumed that I knew how many pieces of information I was going to put into my array when I was writing my code. However, that's often not the case. A lot of times we don't know how many values we're going to assign to our array. And so in those situations, we need to make our array a little bit more dynamic. And so how we do that is when we declare our array, we don't actually pass through how many elements or positions are going to be in it. However, at a later point in our code, we can then specify it. So we can't necessarily negate the fact that we have to specify the number of positions, but all we're giving ourselves is more time to basically determine when we want to specify how many positions it has. And so to do that, we just simply pass through brackets when we are declaring our array. So we don't specify a number or a range. Now, at a later point in our code, we will have to specify how many pieces of information are in our array. And so we do that by using the redim keyword. And what this will do is resize our array. And then from here, we specify again the lower position to the upper position. So in this example, I'm simply saying, hey, resize it so that way it has a range 0 to 4. Now, how would you usually do this? Well, for example, maybe you have a counter that's going to count the number of cells that have information that you want to store in your array. So all you're doing is you're usually calculating how many positions that you want to have your array to be capable of having. You just do that later in the code and then you resize it. Once we resized our array, now we can start assigning values to it. So right down here, if we so choose, we can now start assigning our values to our array. And so here I'm setting my first position equal to the value 100, my second position to 200, my third position to 300, my fourth position to 400, and my fifth position to 500. If I try to assign a value to a position that does not exist in my array, we will get an error. So let's run this. So we get runtime error 9, subscript out of range. Basically all this means when we're working with an array is that you're trying to assign a value to a position that doesn't exist. It can go both ways. So maybe I'm trying to specify position 0, but I declared it 1 to 3. That will do a subscript out of range. So that's just a little bit of a forewarning to you. You cannot assign values to a position in an array that does not exist. Now, since we have values in our array now, what if we want to loop through those values and maybe do something like print it, right? Well, it's really simple. We have two different options. We can use a for loop or a for each loop. If we use a for loop, we know that we have to specify our starting position and our ending position. And here I'm simply declaring a variable that's going to be a long data type. And then I'm going to specify the starting position to be the lower bound of my array and then the ending position to be the upper bound of my array. And so these are built-in functions in VBA, so lower bound and upper bound. And what I do is I pass through my array, and this little section right here will return the lower bound of my array, or position 0. And then this one will return the upper bound of my array, or position 4. So really, it's like for I equals 0 to 4. And then what I'm doing is I'm printing each value in my array. So I'm passing through my array, and then I'm going to pass through the element that I want returned back to me. And so what this is going to do is when I equals 0, it's going to return back 100. When I is equal to 1, it will pass back 200, and it will print it right down here for me. So let's run it. So as you can see, it printed out each individual value. So just like we were expecting. Now I don't have to use a for loop. I can use a for each loop. With a for each loop, we know that it's simply iterating over each element in my array. And so that's really all I'm doing here, as I'm iterating over each element in my array. Now, again, because I'm going to assume that I don't know what is inside my array, when I declare my element, I'm going to declare it as a variant, so that way it can handle different types of data. And then I'm simply printing each element in my immediate window. So when I run this, we get the same exact information. So that's how we loop through an array. Let's assume that we've declared our array, we've assigned some values to it, but now we want to erase it. So we want to clear it out and maybe start over, or maybe we want to declare a whole new array. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to comment this out. To declare an array, there's two different ways really. Well, they're really the same way of doing it, but they can have two different outcomes depending on how we created our array. If we specified the range of our array in the beginning, so in other words, we specified a beginning portion and a lower portion, when I call the erase keyword on my array, what this will do is it will keep my position, so it will keep a range of 0 to 3. However, it will set all the values in my array equal to 0. So if there was a value in it, it would now be 0 for everything. Now, this is assuming that we specified the range of our array in the beginning of it. If we did not specify the range of our array in the beginning, so when we declared it, so we made a dynamic array and then we resized that array, and then we call the erase keyword on my array, then what will happen is this will actually erase the array from memory. The reason why is it's basically taken a step back in time to right up here. So we've created an array, however, we haven't specified the range of that array. So it's basically going back to when we declared it, in the sense that it doesn't know the range and it's not going to go back to here. It's going back to here. So good thing to keep in mind when you're using the erase keyword is to know the outcome of what will happen if you call it on a different type of an array. Now, say we create an array and then we want to resize it. Well, we've already specified how we do that. We use the redim keyword, but again, there's kind of consequences of what will happen if we use that on a particular type of array. So say, for example, again, we've declared a dynamic array, so we haven't specified the range, and then we've assigned a value to the first position. And then I go and call the redim keyword, and I resize my array from position 0 to position 4. In this example, the my first element value that is in the first position will be deleted. So it's like it never existed. Say we wanted to keep that information. So say we wanted to keep that information that we stored in that array. Well, if we wanted to do that, what we could do is we use the redim keyword, but we use it along with the preserve keyword, and then we again specify how far we want this array to go out. And so we're specifying the range of 0 to 4. So if we use the preserve keyword with the redim keyword, it will keep our information that we've assigned in our array. So it's basically like it's extending our array. That's how we kind of think about it. So that's using the redim keyword. Now, we've done in the last couple examples, we've assumed there's only one dimension of our array, so really only kind of like one column of information. But there's nothing stopping us from doing a multi-dimensional array. And so in other words, we can store 2 dimensions of information. I will say, if you're going above 2 or 3 dimensions of an array, it gets a little bit messy, and more than likely there's another way to do it that's probably not as complicated. So I would really limit you to 2 dimensions, because again, once you kind of start going above 2, things become a little bit more complicated. So to work with a 2-dimensional array, it's very similar to how we declare it. Again, we call the variable name, so we specify the name of our array. We specify the range of our first dimension, so again, this will be range 0 to 3. And then we specify the range of our second dimension, 0 to 3, and then we just separate that with a comma. Here, again, the logic holds the same. You can do variant, you can do integer. Really, it all depends on kind of how you want to do it. In this one, I know that all my information in here is going to be an integer data type, so I will simply declare my entire multi-dimensional array as an integer. And in this example, I am assigning a value to each element in my array. And really how we do this one is we've got to kind of break our loops into nested loops, where on the outer loop we're looping through the first dimension of our array, and then we're looping through the second dimension of our array on the inner loop, or the nested loop. And it's still the same. We're still calling the lower bound and the upper bound functions on our multi-dimensional array. It's just that on the outer loop we now separate that with a comma and the dimension that we want to loop through. Now again, this is the inner one, this is the outer one. And then same here, the upper bound function behaves exactly the same. We're just specifying the dimension that we are going to loop through, and we want to return the end of that dimension, so the last position in it. And then in our inner loop, we've now just changed it from 1 to 2. So this is now specifying the second dimension of information. And then all I've done is I'm going through each element in my multi-dimensional array, and I'm simply assigning the sum of I and j to that particular position. And note how I'm denoting the position of my array. So I'm just passing through two values now, vice 1. Here I pass through one value. Here I have to pass through two values to specify a position. And then from here, what I'm doing is I'm looping back through it, but now I'm simply printing each value into my immediate window. So right down here. So if I run this, let's see what we get. Perfect. So we get 0, 1, 2, 3, and then lots of good information, right? So again, it just turned back out each individual element in our particular array. So a lot of good information here. So that does it for arrays. I want to kind of keep it simple, kind of just introduce us to the topic. And then naturally, as we encounter the situations where we might need to work with an array, we'll kind of explore that topic a little bit more detail. But really, I kind of like to reserve that for an actual example. But really, this should be more than enough to get you started, to get you kind of comfortable with it. But again, there's really nothing stopping you from this point to now create an array and then maybe store a value within that array, because we know how to loop through it. And then we can just maybe take this, for example, and say, hey, we want to set this equal to, maybe a cell value or something like that. So again, logic holds exactly the same. But, when we encounter those situations, we will definitely kind of talk through it and see, why we chose an array in that particular situation. So if you have any questions about, how to use arrays, examples of maybe when we might want to cover them, or, something like along that line of thought, please put them down in the comments below, and I'll make sure to get back to you. Also, if you can make sure to like the video, we're trying to grow the channel and everything like that, so your support definitely does help, and we always appreciate it. And also, if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel, so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So thanks again for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next video.